I'm going to be talking about Rails internationalization. This is a beginner's talk, so I'm going to be going over basically the basic stuff you need to know to use this API in Rails. And I'm also going to try to make the case that even if you don't ever intend to have multiple languages in your app, it's still this API is still useful and you should still use it. All right, and to help make that case, I've got a demo application that I've made. This is a website where you can buy pictures of cute, sleepy kitties, and you can log in and upload your own. And I'm going to use this as the example app. All right. It's got cute cats. It's got pluralization with the letter Z, and it's got exclamation points. I think it's got everything I need for it to be a success and make lots of money. Let's see how it can fail. All right. So we're going to talk about what internationalization and localization are. Internationalization, it's often abbreviated i18n because there are 18 letters between the I and the N. So it's I and then 18 letters and then N. Internationalization is basically setting up your application so that it is capable of displaying itself in potentially multiple different languages. A very closely related term is localization, which is often abbreviated as L10N. Localization is just picking one of those translations in a internationalized app. It's basically how do you pick which locale to use to get which translation. All right, let's look at some code. Oops, got to open the code. Okay. You're going to probably see some of my work practice here. Just brief. Is that big enough? Everybody seeing the back? Yep. Okay, cool. All right, so I've got this app that I created. So I've got this app that I've created. I've used Draper to refactor my views so that if you look at the various views, I don't have any logic in my views. So it looks pretty good. The only problem is I do have quite a bit of content in my views. And that's actually a problem. So it's a violation of the single responsibility principle, which basically says that everything should have one responsibility, and the way it describes your responsibility is things should have one and only one reason to change. So I have these views that are describing the structure of my pages, and they also have the content of my pages. So if the structure of the pages needs to change, I have to go and change my views. If the content changes, I need to go and change my views. So that's one reason to change to make. Also, another problem you can see, I've got this sleepy cats thing here, and I've got it repeated here. And if we go and look in my top nav, I've got it repeated here. So that's a violation of the principle of dry, don't repeat yourself. And finally, as an illustration of why having the content in here is not good, I've done some market research, and I figured out that my app will actually be a lot more successful if instead of cats, I refer to them as kitties because it's cuter. And so I want to change all of these cats to kitties, but I have the word cat all over my views, and I have to go into each one of my views and find all of the places where I refer to it as a cat and change it to kitty. And that's bad. But fortunately, Rails has the internationalization API, which gives us a place to put this content where we don't have these problems. So let's take a look at how that works. So the key, basically where you put your content is in translations. And translations live by default in the config locales folder inside your app. And normally there would be one YAML file for each language that you have. You can configure this in lots of different ways, but this is how it's set up by default. You can also use Ruby files instead of YAML files if you want, but everybody uses YAML. So when you first create a Rails app, you get this default English translation file, and you can I cut off the top of it because it's just comments. But at the bottom, you can see you've got the actual language at the top level, and then underneath that, you define keys that have your actual translations. Now, you need to be able to use this. You need to be able to pull these out in your app somewhere. So Rails has an API for looking these up, and the basic lookup is you have this i18n dot. There's actually a translate method, and they have a T alias for short. And you just look it up by the key, and you can specify the key as a symbol or as a string. And then if you're in a view, it's even easier. There's a helper method called T that just uses the i18n key to look it up, and it does a little bit of extra special stuff if it doesn't find a translation. It creates a span tag, but for the most part, it does the same thing. So let's look at what that looks like in our app over here. So I'm going to make a real quick change to implement basic lookup. And so what I've done here in my en.yaml file, I've gotten rid of that hello because I don't need it, and I've created an app title and put sleepy cats in there. And then over in my index.html, I replaced that content with this lookup, and then I did the same thing over here in my top nav. So if you go to my app and refresh, everything still looks great. But if I wanted to change this, like spell sleepy like that to make it even more like it as cheeseburger, I just change it once, and up here in my page title and my nav bar and the heading of this page, it all changes. So I just have to change it in one place, which we like. I like changing things in one place. All right, so before I translate the add translations for the rest of my app, we need to talk about the scopes. So in your translations file, you can have additional levels. You can nest different things underneath your language, and these are scopes. So here I've defined a scope called pages, and underneath that I've nested a scope called index, and underneath that scope I've defined the actual key called title. And then, so there are a couple ways we can look that up. You can pass the scope hash argument and give it an array of the scope. You can also, as a shortcut, define the scope with a string with the dot separating the values. And even easier, you can just use that as the key in the lookup and just put the scope and the key all together in one string separated by dots. So let's go ahead and do that in our code over here. Okay, so in my en.yaml file here, I've defined two top-level scopes, shared and cats, to match my view structure. And then underneath that, I've created a bunch of keys for pretty much everything in my views. And it's still everything all still works the same way. But the cool thing is, now there's only one place I need to go to change all of my cats to kitties. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so the only thing I've done is I've changed cats and kitties in this YAML file. And then when I refresh, it says kitties everywhere. So now it's thoroughly cute, and I expect this to go viral sometime during the next presentation. All right. Oh, but there's one problem. Okay, I can go on and talk about this first. Okay, let's talk about defaults in your lookups. So you can provide a default value in lookup. The simplest and I think probably the least useful is where you just supply an actual literal value. So what this does is it looks up, it's looking for the key hello, and if it doesn't find it, it will take the default value given, it's hello world. The somewhat more useful thing you can do is you can pass a symbol as the default, and then it will actually try to look up the key. It will use that as the key to try to look up the default value. It'll fall back on it. So this will first try to look up pages.index.title. If it doesn't find that, it'll try to look up app_title. And then finally, you can pass actually an array as the default, and it'll go through the array in order until it finds something that matches. Although it doesn't make sense to have an actual string anywhere at the end of this array, because once there's a string, it'll obviously match. All right, so let's go back and look at this code, and I want to point out another little problem that we have in here. So if we look at, let's see, signed in nav is a good one to look at. I've defined all of these keys everywhere, but I've got this this shared signed in nav. I've got that duplicated a bunch. Basically, a lot of my here's a good example. A lot of these pages have these scopes that are duplicated a lot. Fortunately, Rails has an easy way, provides an easy way to deal with that, called lazy lookup. So what lazy lookup does, if you've got, there's a default scope for a view based on the path and name of your view. So in this case, it could be pages and index. So if you've got a translation with the scope pages and then index, which you would look up like this, because the pages and the index of your translation matches the path of your view, you can actually just leave off the scope and put a period in front of it, and when Rails sees that period, it'll tack on the default scope to the beginning of that. So we can change our code to and now we've reduced that duplication, so we're just using the period at the beginning and getting the default scope for these things. I actually have a love-hate relationship with this feature, because the one problem, it's nice and convenient. The one problem is that your views, then your translations then become coupled to the way you've laid out your views. So it's great until you start extracting partials, then you have to go back in and move your stuff around in your translation. So I don't like anything that makes refactoring harder.
Will the partial have different results based on where it's rendered?
It's just the name of the part. It's actually the name of the partial is where it gets. It's the name of the file is where it gets the default scope. Okay. And so there's another problem I want to talk about in my file here. So I don't like the way I've done this sign in and sign in with Twitter. I've created a scope called sign in, and underneath that I've created Twitter and sign in with Twitter, and presumably I would later add Facebook and sign in with Facebook, and maybe Meetup and sign in with Meetup. And I've got all these translations where they're all the same. It's sign in with and then the provider. And the sign in with is the only thing that needs to be translated, in fact, because the Twitter is going to be Twitter in any language. So it's a problem. And we can also see a similar problem over here in my cat decorator. The byline here is actually not internationalized here because I've used string interpolation, and I didn't know how to do that with what I've shown you so far. So Rails has a nice solution for these problems called interpolation. And interpolation in Rails internationalization works pretty much very similarly to how string interpolation works, except you use a percent sign instead of a hash mark. And then when you're looking it up, you just pass the variables as hash parameters, and it just substitutes that in. So this will spit out hello world. So if we, where's my timer?
Oh, wait there.
Okay. So check out interpolation, and look, what I've done with my translation here is I've just made the one key called sign in, and then I say sign in with and the provider. So then I can just add as many different providers as I want, and they all use the same translation. And over here where I use that, I just say .sign in and provider Twitter. And then over here in my, and then at the bottom I added a translation to the byline that just says by and whoever gets the credit. And I just changed my decorator to use that, do that lookup right there and pass it there. And see if I sign out, still says sign in with Twitter. And the byline still says by whoever took the photograph. Okay. Moving on. Okay, another cool thing that Rails internationalization does, actually the whole system is internationalized. And this includes the human readable names of your models and your attributes. It gives you the ability to override these and provide your own translations. So in addition to being able to translate your model names into different languages, you can provide better human readable names if you want. So one example is the model name here. You just say the scope is ActiveRecord models, and then you have your model name, and in this case user, and then I'm giving it a name blocker. And we can see we can use that over here in our code. And I've added this here in my ActiveRecord models, my cat model. I've made the humanized name Kitty. And then over in my, I didn't show you this before, but I used to have in my, prior to this, I had in my submit here, I had an actual, I was overriding, I was providing an explicit name for the label for the submit button, but now I don't have to have that in my new and edit forms. And when I go to, and it just says it automatically uses Kitty. It's the human readable name of that model. But I don't like these names image and credit here. Those kind of sound like they were attribute names that were thought of by an engineer and are not necessarily what I want the end user to see. So I can also, with Rails internationalization, you can provide your own human readable attribute names. In this case, the scope is ActiveRecord and attributes, and then your model name, and then you have underneath that your keys or your attribute names. You can change them to whatever you want. So if we make that change, change image to photograph and credit to photographer. So then, oops. If I look at one of my forms now, I have photograph and photographer. So this is nice. This lets you change those human readable attribute names in one place instead of having to go in and edit your forms. All right, and one more thing I want to talk about before I get in very briefly into localization. You can also, ActiveRecord error messages are also, because everything is internationalized in Rails, ActiveRecord error messages are part of everything. So the way this works is when you have a validator in your model, each validation has a particular key that it's associated with that it will use to look up a message. In the case of validates present of, that key is blank, and there's actually a list of like 5 or 6 different places that it'll look to find to look up a message. The first place is in the ActiveRecord errors, models, and then your model, and then the key blank. The next place it looks is ActiveRecord errors and messages, and then the key. So, and also in addition to the key, a lot of these validations at least have interpolation variables that they provide. So in this case, the attribute is probably provided by all. But I'm not going to show you that because I don't have errors in my app. So I'm going to get into localization. So there are a number of strategies you can use for localization. You can look at the top level domain and figure out what the locale should be. You can set a subdomain and as a locale, so I could have like es.sleepykitties.com. It would automatically set the es as the locale. But what I've done. What I've done is I've set up just using a URL parameter. So I create this before action, which is like a before filter. Rails 4 adds before action as an alias to set the locale based on the locale parameter, and then. In order for this to work and not switch back to your default locale, you have to be able to keep passing that URL parameter throughout the whole app, which could be pretty much nearly impossible, except that you have this cool thing called default URL options, which will do it for you. And it just makes it just work. And I added a translation into my config, so I actually have to restart the app here. Once I do that, if I refresh here, or actually not refresh, I click on something, so I get this locale in here, and I've added an additional, in my translations, in the config locales, I've added an additional translation for Beaker, to translate everything to Beaker speak. So I can go up here and just change my locale to Beaker, and then everything is translated so that Beaker can understand it, communicate. When I click on anything, it keeps threading that locale through. So that is, I think, it for the presentation. There's more stuff that the internationalization API can do. It's pretty well documented in the Rails guides, so that's where to find out more about it. And I have about 5 minutes for questions.
What about pluralization?
Pluralization is something I didn't get into. It's a little bit more complex.
It's in there, though.
It is in there, yeah. Yeah, you can provide you can say how to pluralize it for one, and then how to pluralize it for something other than one.
Okay.
It's an extension to the inflected module of ActiveSport.
Okay. Brian?
I noticed your translation file had a lot of duplication in it itself.
Yes.
Do you have any
Size.
advice for that?
I don't know. I'm not an expert. There's probably a way to reduce that and make that drier, but I don't know.
There is a feature of YAML which I don't know.
Yeah, you
It's
can
not,
you can
but
use
you
that.
could use that.
That's true.
Can you pass that attribute for that way where you pass it in interpolation? Can you pass it in another translation thing? So that's that twice basically. So you can make a translation that's just like kitties and then have that passed into your other stuff.
Well, you can pass in anything as the value, so you could do another lookup to pass that value in. So that that might be one strategy.
Then the calls might be a mess if you have a lot to try to clean it.
Yeah.
There's a problem if you have to refactor your
I think if your site just gets big enough, it's going to be like that. You're just going to have 1,000 things that you want to translate.
Yeah, probably.
I know there's copy or something like that.
Yeah.
It's supposed to make it easier.
Okay.
Like easier.
Not really.
Is dead.
I was just saying, it's a way to offload it from the responsibility of the developer.
Exactly. That means it's easier.
All right, any other questions, comments? Yes?
If you have something that appears on multiple views, does it have to be scoped for everything, or can it be like a top level?
You can make it a top level key and just look it up.
Okay.
Like I did that with app title actually.
Okay.
I had that use on multiple